He's one of the most prominent diversity trainers in the United States. He's been very critical of me. Hey, David, I'm writing because I owe you an apology. I didn't want to see the extent of anti-Semitism on the left that you have been calling out, but recent events have made it clear that, as you said, it is a serious and heartbreaking problem. In any case, I try to live my life in integrity, and so I couldn't not reach out to you and apologize for how stubborn I was in our conversations.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to JTV. Well, the guest that I'm introducing today, I said after our previous interview with him that it was one of my favorite interviews on JTV that we'd ever conducted. Today, we're really privileged to be joined again by David Bernstein, who's currently in Florida. David Bernstein wrote a book called Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. And we spoke to him about a year ago on JTV and spoke all about his book. David himself is a liberal. He set up the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And goodness me, there's a lot has happened in our world over the past year since we last spoke. David, first of all, thank you for making the time to be here today. I really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Someone said to me earlier today, when I said, the world has really changed, over these past few months since October 7th. And they said something to me that was quite poignant and really reflects on our previous conversation. He said, no, it hasn't. It hasn't changed. It's just that October 7th and the aftermath has revealed what perhaps some people were in denial about. But it was always there, and we've perhaps been sleepwalking for a while. I mean, you've obviously not been sleepwalking, and you've been kind of sounding the alarm. I mean, we had one comment on one of our JT videos saying, I can't believe BLM, Black Lives Matter, that they're celebrating Hamas and putting out these paraglider images, celebrating them. And I was thinking, where have you been living all this time? They're so obviously anti-American, radical Marxists. The issue is not dealing with racism in their mind, or rather it's a far broader kind of issue that they're dealing with. But let's start off with your analysis of what's been happening over the past few months, particularly with regard to the woke ideology and how we've seen how they've managed to justify the most abhorrent actions.
Yeah. So let me just first start out by saying that even I, as somebody who's been following this closely, was a bit surprised by some of the extremist voices. I would have thought that they would come out and say, yeah, that's terrible, but Israel had it coming. And they didn't. They skipped that first phrase, that basic human decency, and went right toward this is the resistance, and celebrating in some cases the hang glider memes that came out of Instagram and the like. So to me, I was a bit surprised how brazen they were, but not surprised at the general response. Obviously, this is what I've been following. I think what it also exposed is that when we're talking about wokeism, or whatever we're going to call it these days, now I sometimes joke it's like the W word, because you can't actually say the word anymore. When you talk about wokeism, there are two distinct but overlapping camps. I think we should be honest about it. There's the sort of what I call the decolonization camp. These are the really extreme voices who want to overthrow the fundamental structures of Western societies. They want to decolonize everything. They see mostly they're anti-capitalist, so they see capitalism as a fundamental white supremacy force in society and the like. And then there's sort of a more moderate camp that comes out of the same ideological sewer, if you will, but sees is trying to reconcile itself with capitalism, is trying to change the power equation within the capitalistic society. And so I think you see two fundamentally you see two camps within this larger tent. Sometimes they're overlapping.
That's really interesting distinction to make there. We'll get into that analysis in a second, but I'd like to know what's been your focus, your strategic focus, because you're primarily an activist. You're trying to create social and political change. What have you been focused on tackling? Because there's so many angles to look at this.
Yes. Yeah, it is actually hard to choose what to do in this environment. It's somebody who's been trying to do this work, and all of a sudden you have this golden opportunity to try to drive it home. Obviously, no one wanted the backdrop and what happened in Israel to create that opportunity, but now, here we are. I think that there are two things that we're focused on. One is internal within the Jewish world, and the other is external. Internally, this is what Bret Stephens calls sort of the October 8th Jew moment, right? This is where the Jewish community can reevaluate its political and ideological commitments, its alliances, and everything else. And we want to make sure that that process happens. We don't want the Jewish community to snap back to its former October 6th self. And say, okay, we really can't do anything differently. We really can't bear to reconsider any of our commitments. So we're going to do everything we've always done. And I think that's a real danger. I'd almost bet on it, by the way, in a lot of institutions. And the second thing is we want to take this opportunity to really marginalize the bad guys. If there was any advantage to the way that the far left responded, the decolonial camp responded, it actually showed us who they were, and it made it easier for us to go after them. So you have groups like Liberated Ethnic Studies that comes out of California that are trying to change the school curriculum into a decolonial lens, settler colonialism lens, and explicitly portray Israel as a settler colonial state. They've now spoken, and we can now go to any superintendent of public schools or any board, school board, or the governor of a state and say, your government bodies have signed contracts with these groups, and it is time to cut ties. And so we're really trying to drive that home. It's an opportunity that we don't want to miss. So I think that, in general, we're also trying to build alliances, new alliances. If October 7th proved anything, it's that many Jewish organizations, many Jews were in bed with the wrong people. And it's time to reevaluate those alliances, those commitments that we made, and say, okay, well, who are our friends? There's I think it was Liel Leibovitz, the writer, said, love the one you're with. It comes from a famous song, love the one you're with. And I think that means, in other words, love the people who are really committed to you, even if they're committed to you on this set of issues. They don't have to be perfect. And cut ties with people who either were mealy-mouthed about October 7th or are genuinely supportive of Hamas. Those aren't our friends.
Who are some examples that come to mind for you?
Yeah, well, there are all kinds of human service organizations that said nothing about, let's say, the mass rape of Israeli women, or just remained totally silent. So I know, for example, that there are Jewish human service organizations in the anti-rape space and the domestic violence and abuse space that have been shell-shocked by the silence and even the support for Hamas in their own ranks. So, those aren't your friends, and if it makes you reconsider how you do your work and who you do it with, now's that time. As I said before, one of the key groups is the sort of anti-Israel camp that celebrated the hang gliders and the like. And many Jewish groups had sort of a hands-off approach when it came to them. They knew they were out there. They knew that they were their enemy, but they didn't really want to focus on the bad guys. They would oppose them when they were explicitly portrayed Israel as a settler colonial state. But if they didn't explicitly portray Israel that way, if they just taught young school kids about decolonialism and indoctrinated them in their philosophy, they let that go. And I think that's the kind of reconsideration we have to look at. Maybe we have to fight this at a deeper level, like the iceberg metaphor, that there's the manifestations above water of the iceberg, the explicit anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But below the waterline, there's the ideologies that are producing it. And I think we have to now reorient ourselves to fight this fight against anti-Semitism below the waterline and the bummock of the iceberg.
Yeah, and I remember in our previous interview, you said to me you don't believe that we should use their own ideology to defeat them. So don't try and play this game by showing how Jews aren't a white race, even though obviously we're not. And I assume that would mean don't try and argue that Israel is a decolonization project, which in many ways it is. So what exactly do you mean by that in terms of we have to go deeper? Like, What arguments do you think we should deploy? What shouldn't we deploy?
Yeah, some of it is arguments, and some of it is your fundamental focus. So, for example, we have major diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies in American universities. One approach would be to engage those bureaucracies and try to insinuate the anti-Semitism and Jewish story within those DEI bureaucracies so that they protect Jews. But when you're doing that, you're playing the oppression Olympics. You're reinforcing the ideological framework behind diversity, equity, inclusion. And that just gives it power over time. I think what we have to do instead is either push for an overhaul of DEI so that it becomes pluralistic in nature and not ideological, or that we just ban it altogether. But I don't think we should try to win over DEI. I think that's a mistake, and I think that keeps us operating within the same ideological framework. That I think is how I would do it. So the message to me is not to emphasize our own indigenuity. I'm sorry, I probably screwed that up. Our indigenous status as a people. Although I don't mind those arguments. I mean, they're true, but I don't want to petition people for entry. That's not what I'm trying to do. I want to just express who we are as a people. And if you're willing to work with us, if you like us, wonderful. If you don't, then we're not going to beg to get into your coalition.
Mm, mm. And what do you say to those who might say or feel concerned? And I'm saying people in the pro-Jewish and pro-Israel camp that using sort of harder tactics, if you do this, then you're going to face serious consequences. Let's say college professors or students, that they might say that what you do as a result of that is you end up not changing their views, you just push them underground and create more resistance bubbling under the surface that you're not aware of. Now, I say so be it. Ultimately, you've got to be tough. But I just wondered how you'd respond to that argument that some say, no, you've got to use more carrot than stick.
Yeah, I'm more of a stick person than a carrot person these days. In general, that doesn't mean we should never use the carrot, but I think our instincts as a community, particularly in the U.S., and it might differ a bit in other diaspora communities here, the United States has become part of the incumbent class in a way. I mean, I'm sorry, the Jewish community in America sees itself as part of the incumbent class, and and I think that we have to start to see ourselves, at least in certain domains, as the insurgent class. Like, we're behaving like incumbents. So when the anti-Israel group tries to shift the curriculum at a school board, and this is an actual thing that happened in California, and the Jewish community instructs its people not to show up in numbers and scripts a few people to give testimony at the school board meeting. And then the anti-Israel group shows up with banners and anti-Zionist chants and the rest. I think that used to be the playbook, and it's no longer the playbook. That we have to see ourselves as a bit of insurgents and be willing to use up a little bit of our hard-earned political capital in order to push back and show that we're a community of strength. I think now.
So what does that look like?
That looks like showing up with 100 people with our own chants and our own signs. Like, we can exercise a little raw power in that way and not worry about looking like we're the other side. I think we were always worried about playing to the incumbency in our own political system. I think that's not the way to do it anymore. I mean, of course, sometimes it is. So but more often we've got to be able to project raw power, project ourselves, say, over my dead body, are you going to go through with that plan? And be really strong. Use all of the tools in our toolbox in advocacy and not feel like we have something to lose. We've been fighting this as if we have something to lose, and I think that's a losing proposition.
Now, we've seen just last week that famous viral congressional hearing where you had the presidents of MIT, Penn, and Harvard, I believe, basically unable to say that calling for genocide of the Jewish people constitutes harassment. We saw so many examples. I mean, that Cornell professor, a few days after October 7th, saying he found what Hamas did exhilarating. Many Jewish students feeling afraid to be on campuses. Many in the Jewish community feel it's just time to turn our backs on higher education, that ultimately it's failed. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so, I've certainly been paying a lot of attention to that. I have a piece that came out today called Poison Ivy League. It's in the cover. It's the cover story of the Jewish Journal, which is a publication out of Los Angeles. So you can find it online. What I argue is that I think that universities aren't going away, and we have a vested interest in trying to change them and restructure them.
Mm-hmm.
And so our battle really is to restructure the university, not just to have small wins where so-and-so professor is sort of put on leave for a while. I think that's all fine and well, but I just don't think that that should be the fundamental emphasis. I think we need to shift some things. So the first thing I would do is I would try to either change or ban diversity, equity, inclusion bureaucracies on campuses. These are illiberal institutions. They're fanning the flames of anti-Semitism. They reinforce the ideological framework that is giving rise to anti-Semitism in the first place. So I would try to get universities, and some have actually banned their DEI departments, particularly in more conservative states in the United States. I'd like to see more universities starting to shift that away from that. The second thing I would do is I would start to create new institutes of open inquiry in universities to compete against these radicalized, politicized departments. At University of North Carolina, they have one. At Yale Law School, they have one. These are now just coming into their own. And I think they could attract some of the best talent among professors and the like, and some of the best student talent. And eventually, I think there'll be much more interesting places to study. Now, shouldn't every university be about open inquiry? Yes, but they're not. So I think the best way to try to marginalize those radical voices is to create a much more robust presence within the current university structure. And thirdly, we've got to deal with the funding from Arab countries, particularly Qatar, for the American university system. And by the way, the British university system. Qatar has dumped something like $5 billion in the last decade in the U.S. education system. There's a wonderful report from the group ISCAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I'm a fellow for ISCAP. And they've done studies on how the money trail and how that is influencing discourse in America, and particularly universities. I think that's doable. Saudi Arabia once was the main funder of these programs, and after 9/11 backed off because it wanted to reposition itself within American society. I think
what are they officially getting? What are they getting for this funding they're giving to universities, Qatar?
Well, sometimes it's a Middle East studies program that is completely one-sided and, Muslim Brotherhood oriented, and chairs of university departments. In other cases, it may be scientific research. So they have a very specific partnership with the University of Texas A&M that is, and they have a branch of University of Texas A&M in Qatar itself, in Doha, I believe. So they are doing nuclear research with them, and I think that should be a problem in and of itself. So it's one of those two things: either ideology or science.
But are you really telling me you think that, let's say, Qatari money is pulled from universities, that somehow now we're going to have loads of pro-Israel college professors?
No, of course not. I think it's an accelerator of what we're dealing with, but it is not the sole factor. That's why I think you have to do multiple things at one time here. And almost all of the real change is long-term. Like the short-term wins, maybe getting Students for Justice in Palestine off of a campus because they've been engaging in harassing tactics. Like that's happened now at Rutgers and Columbia and several Florida universities and the like. I think that's all well and good, but I think easily another Palestinian advocacy organization can emerge in its place under a different name and do the same things, and it doesn't really get you out of the long-term problem. So I think we've got to we have to put on sort of a long-term strategic lens in dealing with the problems of the university.
Right, and I do wonder whether we're seeing the tide may be starting to turn, or maybe I'm just being a fantasist. We've seen, I think it was Bill Ackman who gives millions of dollars, tens if not into the hundreds, to, I think it's Harvard, right? And I'm not sure the latest, but I think he's threatening to pull that because of their support for basically anti-Semitic terror. I feel like I have seen some people, certainly in the Jewish community, but even beyond that, people who just would maybe associate with a lot of these woke-like causes, saw what happened on October 7th, saw the aftermath, and I wonder how many do you think have been radicalized and how many do you think have actually been pushed towards sanity?
Yeah, it's still very much an open question. I mean, there have been some amazing speeches. I've gotten some amazing emails from people even within the diversity industry who have woken up to what was
Really?
happening and have apologized to me for
Wow.
their critical remarks. Some very prominent people among them. So it is happening. The question is,
Can you elaborate
has
on
it?
what they're saying? Like what how has the penny dropped for them?
Yeah, I could. If you'd like, I can even read you
Please,
someone.
please.
This is. I'm not going to say the name because he hasn't given me the permission to do that. But he's one of the most prominent diversity trainers in the United States, and he's been very critical of me. We've known each other. He's Jewish. He's been very critical of me, and we've had several exchanges. And I'm going to read you and hey, David, first, I hope that your family and colleagues and friends in Israel are okay, or at least as well as can be expected. I'm writing because I owe you an apology. I didn't want to see the extent of anti Semitism on the left that you have been calling out, but recent events have made it clear that, as you said, it is a serious and heartbreaking problem. In any case, I try to live my life in integrity, and so I couldn't not reach out to you and apologize for how stubborn I was in our conversations. Wishing you well and praying for peace. Um, let me give you another one as well. This is from a colleague who heads up a Jewish human service organization who sort of, I won't say cut off ties with me, but went silent. Um, and um, and this is on October 21st. She wrote me, it was my birthday. Happy birthday. My gift to you is to say you're right. I am living and breathing woke anti Semitism every day from my colleagues in human services. It's exhausting. And then since then, we've had several conversations. She read my book, and I think she's turned a new leaf. She's actually taking action with it. So there are many other examples of that.
But
There are people
David,
like Rabbi.
how is the penny dropping for them?
I think that they didn't realize that some of the people that they saw themselves in coalition with in their own ranks would support Hamas after what happened to their Israeli brethren. They just thought that they couldn't imagine that that would be the case. They tolerated a lot, and there was always discomfort, I'm sure, among some of them about some of these views, but they saw them as being fundamentally in the same camp. And I think now they realize they can't. Rabbi Sharon Brouse, who's a very prominent rabbi out of LA, and she runs an organization called ICAR, I think, and has a lot of followers, a lot of young Jews. She gave a rousing speech afterwards, basically saying that she was shocked that there were people were so morally callous that they would not see the humanity in the Jew, and what must have gone through their mind and thinking in their understanding of Jewish power for them to make those statements. So this was sort of a profession of sorrow, but how much will she really be willing to pivot strategically from all this? I'm not
Mm.
yet sure,
Mm.
and I think the jury is out on that for us.
Yeah, and how do we stop people from going back to sleep? Because that obviously is a big concern. And each time we do go back to sleep, the wake up call becomes even greater and more tragic.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to. It has to be an organized strategy to hold these groups accountable, to keep on raising questions, find ways of raising questions to their boards, to their executive committees, put out papers, write articles, find the people in these institutions who already agree with you and get them to speak out. That's one thing I've learned doing this for the last 2.5 years. Almost every institution has moderates, center right people, center left people who know there's a problem. And most
Mm.
often they haven't been willing to speak up about it.
Mm.
Finding those people and then getting them to do the bidding and getting them to raise the tough questions, I think, is critical. And I think that project has to be just much more systematic than it has been up until now. That's what my organization does, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. We're trying to engage these people to create critical mass so that it's impossible for these organizations to slip back into familiar routines.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk a bit about the main political parties in America. I want to talk about both of them. First of all, from the woke anti-Semitism perspective, what would you say the current state of the Democratic Party is?
So the Democratic Party, there hasn't been a total woke takeover. I think a lot of people in our camp want to believe there has been. I don't think that this is not what happened. This is not Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party here. The moderates still outnumber significantly the radical progressives. And probably radical progressives could not win in the majority of Democratic districts in America. That said, the moderates themselves are also constantly looking over their left shoulder and are constantly asking themselves, okay, what do I do here so I don't alienate the progressive wing of the party? And because the moderates are desperate to remain in coalition with the progressives so that they can win in the presidential election upcoming, they are too willing to defer to it. And so that creates different dynamics in the party, which you're seeing probably even in the Biden administration's more recent pronouncements on Israel and so forth. They're worried about losing that wing of the party. And I've seen that very explicitly in very many instances. So I don't think it's an imminent takeover, but it's clearly changed the dynamic in the Democratic Party. We also see this in polling, by the way. For the first time ever in 2023, the majority of Democrats sympathized more by just a very narrow amount with Palestinians than they did Israelis. That was like a 3-1 margin that Israel enjoyed in the Democratic Party just 10 years ago. So you can see how extreme the shift has been recently. Now, we haven't seen that poll taken since October 7th, so we don't know if that will revert back to its previous levels or whether the ongoing coverage of war will alienate the Democratic Party base. But we have seen shifts even at the base level. At the Republican Party, we see great support for Israel, but we see a great also toleration of right-wing anti-Semitism. And we see some really disturbing forces within the right. I think the ideological takeover of the right in the Republican Party has been much more sweeping than it has the Democratic Party. And so for a lot of Jews who are sort of liberal leaning like me, they'll feel politically homeless right now because they're not going to flock toward the MAGA Republican Party and to Donald Trump and the dangers that poses as well. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place in many ways. And I think we have to embrace our political homelessness in a way. We have to see ourselves as being politically independent. And we're going to throw the party and you're invited to our party, but we're not necessarily going to join your party. And I don't just mean political party. I mean our ideological party, our intellectual party, our coalition party. We're going to decide what our interests are, and we're going to invite you. And if you want to come. We're not going to come to your party if you demand a price of admission that we're not willing to pay. We're not going to pay the pound of flesh to be part of a highly ideological advocacy effort as we once were. That's what I want the Jewish community to shift toward. And not everybody's going to shift. Not everybody's going to do anything. The question is, will the center of gravity within the organized Jewish community shift? And I'm hopeful, but I'm not certain by any means that that's going to happen.
Yeah. And I have to say, I have been also quite alarmed by some significant right-wing figures that have basically espoused classical anti-Semitism and certainly anti-Zionism. I didn't really see that coming as much. I know we've had that historically, but I thought that was a bit more socially unacceptable. But I think it's sort of in some ways pivoted from the backlash to cancel culture and using that as a way kind of, no, we've got to say the hard truths. Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Kanye West, all of that lot. Do you think Trump himself, let's say he gets back into office, and that's very possible, right? It may even be the likelihood at this point in terms of if you're a betting man. I want to touch on Biden as well, but how do you think his relationship would be with with Israel in the Middle East moving forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think he was very angry at Bibi, which he's expressed. And if Bibi's prime minister, I think he'll try to take it out on him. And we saw it already in his remarks. I don't think Trump is anti-Israel in any way, and he's probably leans pro-Israel. I think he's a deeply amoral man in many ways, so I don't think he has any psychological or moral attachments to Israel either. I just think that he sees it in his interest to continue to be pro-Israel. He gets a lot of money from some right-wing figures in the Jewish community, and I don't think a huge strategic shift is likely, but because he is who he is, you just never know. I don't think he's deeply committed philosophically to anything. And so I would worry about that because of that quality in him. On Biden, I think Biden is psychologically and morally committed to Israel, but he's now looking at the political tea leaves. He's worried about losing ground in places like Michigan, which is a key battleground state. He sees that there's a drop in support from the progressive wing, and he desperately wants to keep them aligned. So I think he said some things publicly recently and done some things behind the scenes to try to get Israel to wrap up the war quickly that weren't apparent in the first early pronouncements. So you can see how this changing ideological atmosphere in the United States affects the parties. And I think in both cases, there are minority voices within each party, but people are still catering to them because they're much more energetic sectors of the polity than the moderates are. And I think they're both desperately afraid of losing those wings, and so that people cater to them more than they ought to.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair analysis. The question of what the right political solution is in the Middle East with Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. You look at the fact that recent polling shows 75% for Hamas and their actions among Palestinians in both Gaza and Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. You look at the fact that basically I can't think of one real leader among the Palestinians that's actually been a genuine force for peace and reconciliation. You look at the fact that Israel sort of tried a mini two-state solution by disengaging from Gaza, and we saw what we got with that. Where does this leave the prospects of a two-state solution even being, let's say, desirable, or something that people who are in the center, like you, or people in the liberal camp, would find feasible to support? Like, do you think there's two questions? Number one, do you think there's going to be a paradigm shift in terms of what will be the political talking point with regard to two-state solution? And number two, there's not the talking point, but what do you think is actually feasible now and realistic? Like, there has been a paradigm shift, hasn't there?
Yeah, sure. And obviously what happens in Israel matters here as well, how Israelis understand the risks that they face. So I would say that, there's no prospect for a two-state solution anytime soon. And I think U.S. policymakers and others are deluding themselves to think we're going to go from the Hamas massacre in Gaza to a two-state solution in the West Bank. We just got recent polling, by the way, that came out just in the last 2 days that shows that 75% of residents of the West Bank supported the Hamas massacres. It was far lower among Gazans, by the way, because they're obviously bearing the brunt of it. I think from the standpoint of world Jewry, we should understand that a two-state solution is not likely. What I think if I'm an Israeli policymaker, what I would want, what I hope to see, is them not foreclosing on the possibility of it in the future, because I don't know that there's any other long-term way out of this. It's not gonna produce peace now. It's not even gonna allow for a political solution. So that's fine. We understand that, but rein in settlement growth, make sure you don't expand the geographical footprint of Israeli settlements. The other interesting thing is I don't remember who did the original analysis of this, but what you find is that there's less friction in Israeli-Palestinian relations in places where there's a military occupation, but there's no civilian population. So in the northern West Bank, up until recently, there was very little settlement growth, but there were military installations and so forth, and that produced far less friction. And in the interim, that may be the best we can do. Like, I don't think we're going to extricate Israel from the West Bank. And as I think you said, the Israelis read the book in Gaza in 2005, and they're not going to they don't want to watch the movie in the West Bank. So I don't think that they're going to see a major shift in that way. If anything, it's going to do the opposite. They're going to, until they know that they can have a peaceful neighbor on their hands, they're not going to even consider it. But that doesn't mean, but there's a lot of damage that can be done if there's a major further population shift of settlers into the area that make it impossible for you to do something in the future.
Well, I know this is a very hotly contested issue, the issue of settlement growth and building. And I mean, one of the interesting things is that, as a matter of fact, whether or not you are in favor of a two-state solution or not, or settlements or not, but as a matter of fact, you do have more Israeli-Palestinian interactions as a result of settlements. Because now some of them may be negative, but a lot of them they're working together. They're working for Israeli businesses and all the rest of it. And I mean, I saw that up close. I visited loads of Israeli settlements last year, and that was something interesting. And I do think that certainly when we look at Israeli Arabs who have far more exposure to Jews and to Israel, like, exposure is key. And I think across the board, I'm not advocating any particular position there, but I think as a principle, more exposure, interaction with one another is surely a good thing. And I think as a strategy, I've always believed, and a pillar of JTV is that anti-Semitism thrives on mystery, on Jews being a mystery to the world. And so JTV's, one of its missions is to demystify the Jews, demystify Israel and Judaism and all the rest of it. And I think that's also really important.
Yeah, it reminds me of the early days of the internet, when there was this confidence that if you brought people together and we shrunk the world, that we were going to see less conflict, not more. But obviously it can work the opposite direction. I mean, people started to see each other up close and personal, and they didn't like what they saw. And so we've seen a breakdown. Look, I understand what you're saying, and there are certainly examples of Israeli settlers who have created relationships with Palestinians, but you also have certain settlements, and these are probably the most radical settlers, who are constantly looking for revenge, who see it as their mission to disrupt Palestinian life, and that creates tremendous friction. So you can compare this. This is not something that's theoretical. You can look at where there are more Israeli settlers and the level of hostility and interaction versus where there's just an Israeli army presence, and you can see the results. So I'm going on that sort of data point that that for Israel and the West Bank. That doesn't mean I don't want Jews and Arabs to come into contact with each other more generally, but I think I would want fewer points of contact and friction than more in this, given where we are in this today.
Well, I think, the question comes down to, is there more negative or more positive interactions overall? Like, obviously, the more settlers you have in Judea and Samaria, then the more there's whatever percentage are, let's say, radical, there's going to be more interactions in that sense. But I certainly saw a lot of positive interactions.
Sure. I've seen it too.
Yeah, and they're I don't know the numbers on how much violence there is. My impression was that it was not there's not a culture of violence, like, certainly not, like, unlike what you have, let's say, in that we see in Palestinian territories. Lastly, I want to talk to you a bit about just some strategies with regard to higher education. I feel that one of the big and obvious failings here is just there's a lack of teaching basic morality in higher education today. Like, if we can't say basic truths, then we're moral truths, then we've got a real problem here. I wonder whether part of the strategy should not just be political, but also cultural, but particularly with regard to the Bible. And having one of the things I love doing on JTV is sort of almost like an academic analysis of biblical texts. It's something I gained so much from Torah study, basically, but doing it in a way that's really analytical, and looking at sentence structures and finding within that all kinds of deeper meanings and patterns. I felt that if you have that, if you have more literacy with regard to understanding the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and its influence and impact on basic morality that's, impacted all parts of our world, but in particular America and the Western world, then that surely is going to play quite an important role in an appreciation for Jews, the Jewish people, and also their relationship with Israel. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, in a larger sense, maybe going one step deeper down on the iceberg, I think we have to fight for Western values, defend Western values, Enlightenment values vigorously. And that, of course, includes the influence of the Bible, but it's about the larger philosophical traditions that that believe that through our reason, through scientific inquiry, we can approximate the truth, we can pursue the truth. And what we saw that took shape over the course of the last 5 or 6 decades is the precise opposite, a sort of moral and intellectual relativism. You call it postmodernism, that believed that knowledge is really just a construct of the powerful classes that embeds itself in the discourses of society in order to rule over the masses. That's what postmodernism was, and that we have to fundamentally question all of what we consider knowledge, deconstruct it, and then and then analyze everything through the lens of power. Now, what that also did is it morphed into even a more dangerous form of itself. So post-colonial theory and what we might call wokeism today took it one step further. It said, well, we don't have confidence in general in finding the truth, but what we do know is that people who are oppressed have some insights into their oppression that others don't. And so we've given them a platform to claim oppression and silenced everybody else in the process. So that's what this ideology did. And I think we need a very robust defense of Western values, Enlightenment values, and even patriotism and values like that. And I think that obviously, I think the Bible fits in there, but I think we have to find our voices on that. And I'd like to see American Jewish organizations, for example, talk about American values and what it means to them, and stand up for them. It doesn't mean that we have to defend everything America has ever done. To the contrary, it's a country that's constantly striving to live up and sometimes failing to live up to its own highest ideals. So let's do that. There needs to be a version of that in the UK as well, and in Canada and New Zealand and Australia. So I think that's where this has to be done. We need a robust defense of ideas and values.
And lastly, what do you think the future holds for world Jewry, diaspora Jewry? Do you think if things continue to go the way they are going, that 20 years from now, we're basically, most of us are going to be in Israel? Or are you expecting a political shift where more people start to wake up? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. Look, I'm optimistic about America. I'm guardedly optimistic about America because I do believe America has the potential of shifting. America is a country that does change, that is sort of its hallmark is change. It can change in the wrong direction, as we've seen in recent years, but it also could find its footing. And I do believe the center of gravity politically could change. I'm more worried about Europe because also you have these very large Muslim populations that are fundamentally restive and disaffected and the like, and how that affects British Jewry. And then you have, of course, the Red-Green Alliance, the convergence of radical Islam with radical progressive politics, and how that affects the Jewish community. And we see it obviously in the protest movements in London and the like. We have those here too. We have them on campuses. But I think I'm more optimistic that the United States can sort of shift and change course than I am in the diaspora communities in Europe. But again, I don't think it's guaranteed. And I don't know how long we want to be politically homeless in this country. Like, I think that's going to create a lot of existential discomfort among American Jews if this is a prolonged condition and we don't feel comfortable on either side of the political spectrum. I think our hope is to sort of gather the remnants and win, and to help be a factor in the restoration of sanity in American society. If that can't happen or won't happen, I think we're going to be facing a similar plight to our brethren in Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah. Because what's interesting is that it seems like, certainly post October 7th, when it seems like a lot of people, but maybe the majority of those attacked on October 7th, were left-wing peaceniks that were trying
Yes.
to, support Gazans and all the rest of it. It seems like the Israeli youth today are perhaps the only youth generation among the Western world that are shifting more rightwards and becoming a bit more hawkish. And so I think that sort of filters into it. So there's a big question mark. Will Americans wake up? Will they descend into possibly civil war, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking about Americans more generally, I think there are really deep divisions in American society, and neither political party and the leadership has in it sort of that civic spirit to bring people together. They're not looking. They're in a constant cycle of revenge. They're never looking to sort of overcome those deep differences. It used to be that members of Congress used to fight publicly, but then, go to the same gym together and get drinks together at night. And that the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, would have drinks with the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. That doesn't happen anymore. They hate each other behind the scenes as well as in public. And I think that's extremely dangerous. And can we overcome that? I think we possibly can. There's a lot of structural problems that prevent it from happening. I mean, we have the ongoing role of social media and the inflammatory role in our politics. We also have in the United States gerrymandered political districts now in which people vote in their primaries are more radical because they're either more Republican or more Democrat. So you end up voting for more radical voices. So those are structural problems that are hard to overcome in our politics. But that doesn't mean that we won't find a way out. I mean, just look at how divided Israel was before October 7th. I mean, it was on the verge potentially of a civil war itself and is now more united than ever. So one can imagine that happening in the United States or even Europe, but I don't have an easy roadmap for that. Other than the people who agree with us on that, let's start building those ties. Let's start building that new centrist coalition in politics.
Yeah, and it also really touches on the last question I was saying, which is that people also need something to rally around, not just to be against. Hence, re-educating oneself on Western values and all the rest of it, and the roots of them, and giving people also a sense of the reason why I mentioned the Bible is like people need to be their values and principles and things they're fighting for need to be anchored in something transcendent. I think people who are far left and woke feel that they've got a utopian vision for the world. I think radical Islamists think that, and I think we need that as well. People that support the values that we've been discussing. David, thank you so much for your time. Love speaking with you and hearing your analysis. As we've said before, David's book is called Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. He is, as we said, the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. David, thank you for all the work you do in combating anti-Semitism, and look forward to, hopefully, conversations in the future that will be reflecting on a improvement on the situation to what we've seen recently.
I love that. Thank you so much.